Hiya, I'm Andrew. I'm the director here, so I'm in charge of the Arboretum. We're 250 hectares in size. We have 500,000 visitors a year. Obviously, you've been seeing a lot of the visitors walk past today. We've got 15,000 specimen trees here of 2,500 different species.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm Rob, the Biosecurity Officer in the Plant Health Forestry team. So I work in a team of about 30. My teammates go out to forests and sample and check for pests and diseases. And then we treat the trees when we find pests and diseases. And my job is to promote biosecurity, which is being aware of pests and diseases and how we can prevent the spread. Thanks.
My name's James. I'm the Director of Operations for Forestry and Land Management in Forestry England, so I look after stuff that covers all of England, from Northumberland right down to Cornwall, east to west. We have 253,000 hectares of land that we look after. And as you might imagine, that's got a lot of stuff going on in there, a lot of stuff to do with trees and a lot of stuff to do with places where there aren't trees, a lot of stuff to do with harvesting timber, a lot of stuff to do with wildlife and biodiversity conservation. Amongst the things I look after particularly are our health, safety and technical training, and we've got some tree nurseries as well, because we've got to produce little trees to replace the trees that die or the trees we harvest, and we produce 18 million trees out of there every year at the moment.
Follow that. So I'm Sophie. I'm the Programme Manager based at Westonbirt. So I'm normally responsible for development projects, so things like the treetop walkway, the new car park and the welcome building that you entered through today. I also get involved in other new developments that we've got planned, so building a new community shelter for Karen and community groups made out of oak from Westonbirt is on my to-do list, amongst other things. So I'm here partly because I lead the staff green team, so a group of staff started to raise questions about what's happening with things like our waste and recycling. We're kind of questioning, well, what do we want to do as a site about climate change? What can we do? You know, what would we buy a lot of things for things like family events and activities, and we obviously put on things like 10k runs and Christmas events, and we do lots of other day-to-day activities. So how can we make our site greener? Because there's a number of us that feel very passionate about that. So we set up a staff green team, so I lead, and we've been focusing on waste and recycling as one of our first actions. So we now have a waste strategy. We also now have an energy strategy to look at how much energy, how much oil, gas that our buildings use. What can we do to make improvements? So the obvious things that you can do at home. So LED lights that can make quite a big difference to your energy bills. Insulation, turning things off, but also looking at some of the other things that are a bit less obvious, and how much would it cost us to make those changes, and how much will it save us in terms of carbon? So that's what we've been working on at the moment, so it'd be great to hear your thoughts in terms of suggestions for things that we can also change, because obviously with 500,000 visitors a year, that's a lot of other people that have different opinions or different thoughts or levels of understanding in terms of the climate change and what we can do about it. So it'd be good to hear your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Sophie. Come on here at the back. Okay. Yeah. So who would like to start off? Is any questions? I know there is no wrong question. How many different types of trees do we have? Yeah. Exactly, Andrew.
Well, yeah. So I guess I'll answer that in a number of different layers. So worldwide, it was only 4 years ago that for the first time anyone had actually counted how many different tree species there are across the whole world, because there's huge tracts of land in like the Amazon forest that just hadn't been fully explored, and we're now pretty confident that there's something like 60,000 different tree species across the world. And only earlier this month, another report was published, so that in the intervening period, scientists and colleagues of ours have been assessing the threats to all those different tree species, and we know that a third of those 60,000 tree species are threatened with extinction from different things, whether that's climate change, deforestation due to agriculture, development and so on. So worldwide there's 60,000 tree species. Only about 50 of those are native to the United Kingdom. We have a very low level of diversity of tree species in this country, which is due to the effect of the ice ages, and after the last ice age the English Channel was formed very quickly, so tree species weren't able to find their way back to this country before the country became waterlocked. In the Arboretum here though, our mission is to plant as many tree species as we can of certain types that will grow here. And we have about 1,800 different species of tree from all around the world. But if you count what we call the cultivars, so for Japanese maple, which is one species, people have created what are called cultivars where there have been particularly unusual leaf shapes or colours. If you add the cultivars in, we've got about 2,500 different types of tree here. So, you know, it's only a small percentage of the world's total, but it's massively more diverse than the number of tree species you would naturally find in this country. What else is there to say about tree species? I was guessing commercial forestry.
That means Westonbirt as a tree collection is a massive hotspot for tree biodiversity in England, and very important because of that. Out in the wider world of forestry, by which I mean the sort of places where timber's sustainably managed, cut down, replanted, probably, and you've made me think now to count up, but it's probably only about 15 species max, which are really important in terms of the forestry activity and management of woodlands in the UK.
Yeah, and that's one of the problems. You know, we doubled the area of forest in this country in the last century, but we used very few tree species like Sitka spruce, Scots pine, Corsican pine, Japanese larch, and with broad leaves, oak, ash, beech. And the problem with using a very narrow range of tree species is if those tree species get pests and diseases in the way Rob was describing this morning, you know, we now know the larch trees are susceptible to the Phytophthora disease, the ash trees are susceptible to ash dieback. We really hope the spruce don't get susceptible to something, but there is an insect starting to find its way into Kent from the continent called Ips, and so one of our challenges as professional foresters is to actually diversify the range of tree species that we are growing for timber production, because there is a risk that we might not, the tree species we focused on might not be the best tree species for timber production over the next 50 or 100 years.
Yep, I think that covers it.
Yeah. Also, with pests and diseases, if you have a forest that's made up only of one species, so you have a forest that's made up purely of ash, if it does get ash dieback, then you have to, you could potentially have to remove the whole forest. So you want to diversify the trees and have lots of mixed species in a forest, so that you don't have to potentially destroy a whole forest if it gets a pest disease.
Spreading your risks.
Yeah, and obviously for timber production, we are, as foresters, we're looking for trees that grow quickly, that grow fat and straight, because we want to create saw logs that are straight. So a lot of tree species are not suitable for timber production, but they might be great for food production or producing chemicals for cancer drugs. But one of the roles of the Arboretum here is that because we grow so many different types of tree species, we're almost like the very first step of working out are certain tree species suitable for timber production, because as we walk around the Arboretum we can see, well, you can see the ones that are growing straighter and are bigger, and as foresters, when we see those tree species we then start planting bigger plots of them, forest plots, and if those forest plots look like they're promising, we will then potentially plant them on a bigger scale still.
I've got some really good questions here. So, how many trees die from diseases due to the spreading of that disease? How many trees are dying from diseases?
It's thousands of hectares of trees that we have to fell each year. So for like Phytophthora, Morum and Larch. I think it's around 20,000 hectares that we've felled since it first arrived.
It's probably 1,000 trees per hectare at that age, isn't there? So what's that, 20 million trees?
Yeah.
Or is it more than 20 million? I can't do the maths.
So
20,000 times 1,000.
So it's, yes.
Whatever, 20,000.
20 million.
20 million, isn't it? 20 million just larch trees from one disease, yeah.
And then on top of the loss of trees, you also have the damage that's caused to the biodiversity in the area. So you'll lose sort of insects and mammals that rely on those trees for their food and shelter. And then there's also damage to the timber trade, as we've mentioned as well, because they'll have losses in the amount that they can produce and sell. And then if it's trees that are in the urban environment, it means you'll lose all the nice trees that could line a street, which give us shade, which keeps cities cool. So with less trees, you'll have a hotter cities. And there's also lots of health and well-being benefits as well to being near trees and being out in nature. So you lose more than just trees. You can lose sort of the health and well-being benefits, the timber industry, and local amenities. So have trees on your street. So there's lots of losses as well.
Just going to wait for the second meal to arrive, and I will fire some more questions at you. If you don't get a chance to ask all your questions today, I will be asking the panel to make sure everything send that down to comments, their answers.
I think we need to put a positive message out though in relation to the 20 million trees. Sounds a huge number, but as James said, how many trees do we produce out of that, Dylan? How many trees are we planting just on Forestry England?
Oh well, we're producing nearly 20 million trees a year from our nurseries.
We are.
About half of those are getting planted in England, and we're sending the rest off to Scotland and Wales to be planted there.
So we are able to replace them quite quickly, although it does have all these impacts. It's not all doom and gloom. No. Rob.
Yeah, sorry.
I think that's something we have to be quite aware of as well, that we have got time now to change.
Yeah.
So related to that one, will there be an extinction of a species due to a disease currently?
I'm trying to think of a tree species that has become susceptible just to disease.
Do you mean it's a tree species or a related, like an animal or something like that species?
Yeah, I mean...
Tree species.
There are... I mean, that is the risk to any tree species which has a really narrow range becomes very vulnerable to all these sorts of threats. So some of you might know that there was a new tree species found in Australia barely 20 years ago called the Wallamy Pine. We do have 5 planted in the Arboretum. They hadn't been found previously because they're just in like mini canyons, but they were discovered 20 years ago, and I mean, the total number of trees of that species that remain can be numbered in the hundreds. There's possibly 200 or 300 of them. They were known from the fossil record as having existed historically, but then living ones were found. Now, in the subsequent 20 years, those trees and their location is very heavily guarded because of the concern that people might bring disease into them that they aren't currently or haven't historically been subject to, particularly these Phytophthora type diseases. And also, as you'll probably have heard from the news, Australia's suffered, like the United States, bad forest fires. They had to take special measures to protect these trees from forest fires in the region, and actually it was through the forest firefighting work they discovered further mini populations of that species that hadn't been subsequently discovered in the last 20 years. So yeah, tree disease does potentially risk wiping out whole species, and there's a good example of threatened trees. The threatened trees don't just exist overseas or in the Amazon rainforest or places like Australia. In this country we have a tree species called the white bean, which typically grows in river valleys, and scientists or taxonomists can actually divide that tree species into multiple individual species with very subtle differences between them. But in the Avon Gorge in Bristol, for example, there's something called the Bristol white bean, and in that native population there are only something like 17 trees in its natural environment. But those trees have been propagated, and we have a number in the Arboretum here and a number planted elsewhere. But the real importance of trying to save those species is that for many of them we don't know what they might be useful for in the future. Many tree species have insects that might be very specific in relying just on that tree species. We know that some tree species, even like our yew trees, have a really important role in medicine, and obviously we know native peoples from different countries around the world have got lots of medical or herbal remedies that they rely on being produced from different types of tree species.
A thought came into my head. Oh, that was it. And I think with the Wallamy Pine, for me it was fascinating to know that a tree we knew from fossils, but then soon was extinct, was discovered 20 years ago. So it's still possible to discover or rediscover trees and plants and animals even now. So if you ever want to become a plant hunter or an animal hunter, not in a
There was another one in the middle of the 20th century, the dawn redwood, that was discovered in a remote spot in China, and now it's really quite a common tree in ornamental gardens, and we've got several examples in the Arboretum that are now probably 20-30 metres tall.
How long do you think it would take to start overcoming all of the damage caused by climate change on our environment and the habitats? If we just start acting in the next 5 years, is it?
Overcoming all of the damage.
So if everyone did everything they said they were going to do, so every government everywhere on the planet did all the things they said they were going to do under the Paris climate change agreement. I was reading this yesterday, so I hope I've got it right. We still wouldn't get down to the to zero temperature rise compared to the reference period. That'd still be somewhere between 2 and 1.5 degrees. So if you're asking by the damage. So if we limit the damage by not having any rise in temperature at all, we would have to be doing a lot more even than has been promised by politicians and governments. And we'd have to be doing it fast and consistently. So it's more a case of how can we work hard to make sure the changes in the climate and the global warming are as small as they can be. But there will be some. It seems almost inevitable that there will be some, and some damage will come with it.
So can I throw that question back to the group? What do you think we can do to help reduce that amount of damage? We start on a kind of Westonbirt, local Gloucestershire area.
With things like plastic, so you've got plastic around like your trees, couldn't you just use like string or something? Because that's black plastic, which is obviously the worst kind of plastic.
Yes, it's a good question. An alternative would be to use wire, which is potentially more easily recycled. I think that black plastic is made from recycled plastic itself, but yes, it's a plastic, you're correct, yeah.
So, and you may be seen all over the place, not so much in the Arboretum, that what we call tree tubes.
Yes.
They're sort of brown coloured tubes that the little trees go in, and they're like mini greenhouses, and they help the trees grow quick. Those are plastic. They're sold as biodegradable, but they're not really. They're photodegradable, so what they do is they just break down in sunlight and leave you with lots of little bits of plastic on the ground. There's a lot of work going on just now to replace those with something which isn't plastic, and the best candidates at the moment are actually made out of a material which is based on sheep's wool. But we're still waiting for those to be manufactured in quantities which really make a difference. But there is a lot of work going into removing that sort of single-use plastic from the way we grow trees.
We've got those being trialled. If you head towards the coppice, towards the end of the walkway, you can see a number of those different products being trialled in the coppice coops to see how they fare here. So they're being trialled on site, and the black plastic around the trees is the team that obviously pop that out reuse it as much as they can. So it goes out and it gets taken back in, and they kind of cobble it together as much as possible until it's at its end of life. So it's not a single-use plastic, so they are reusing it. And I think this year they've managed to negotiate with the supplier and the manufacturer to take back that plastic and ensure it is recycled. So although it is black plastic and difficult, because that manufacturer creates it as such a quantity, and our order is a very bespoke specialist order that I think we place every sort of 5 years, that they've negotiated to take that back and close loop it. But obviously it's not ideal to use plastic and have to reprocess it, so it's a fair question to ask. Well, yes, we could probably find an alternative, but it would probably need a bit of thought in terms of what else would be suitable and impact on aesthetics and protecting the tree from pests.
And some of these decisions aren't as obvious as they might appear. So again, that Sophie's mentioned the coppice coops. We use the same black plastic to temporarily fence round each coppice coop, which is cut each year just for 12 months, and then it's moved on to the next coop. And if we used metal fencing, that would be much more difficult to reuse as fencing. So the metal fencing is amenable to being melted down and to create a whole new product, but it's really difficult to actually, once it's got bent, to reuse it in its current form, as it were. And then you're trying to balance, well, what is the disbenefit of having that type of plastic that might be possible to reuse 10 times versus using a metal fence which has all the energy needed to melt it down to remake a whole new strip of metal fence. But you also asked, well, are there other alternatives that we maybe need to think of as well? Could we use electric fencing or something that wouldn't need as much material.
Some of them are used, is it to prevent deer from eating small trees as well?
Yes, so these are particularly to keep rabbits and deer off. So yes, in trying to protect a tree and get the benefits of the tree or the coppice for wildlife, yeah, we're making a bit of a compromise perhaps around a product. But yeah, we are trying to actively think around those issues, as Sophie mentioned. I think another plastic issue we have with our trees is, you might have noticed that on our special specimen trees that we have these botanical labels with the names on. They are also made from plastic. Again, we're giving some thought to, are there alternatives? But it's really difficult to find something that remains legible, that doesn't degrade in the sunlight, because some of those labels, if they're not damaged by squirrels, that's another problem. Squirrels like them. What will last for 10 years and still be legible?
And I think the thing with plastics, it is an area that we're looking into, and we're trying to recycle more and kind of question it more. But it's things like the tape on the benches and around the fire pit site. We're all creatures of habit, and we just go back to the same things that we've used again and again without questioning, well, actually, would a bit of string do? Or something that can be reused or biodegrade or decompose without turning into a microplastic or something bad. So it's also us all educating everyone to, well, actually, what's it made of, where's it come from, how do I dispose of it, can I reuse it again and again? So it's a bit of a learning curve, and as more and more products will come onto the market as people invent and create new products that fix issues that we have at the moment. But I think we all have an ability to question and ask people, well, you don't need to use that, you could use something else instead. So that would be my thought back to you, to keep asking people, what is this made of, what can I do with it?
3 years ago our name badges were plastic. We now have wooden name badges, and I think another little thing we're making progress on is the likes of that sign over there, the keep out sign. Typically those might only be up for 3 or 6 months. We have now got a supplier that can make those out of fairly robust cardboard type material, and those of you who went up with Karen and I to see the felling area, you see there were 5 information panels. We used to create those information panels out of a plasticky material. They are now a biodegradable.
It's card coated in clay, so that we can and they can properly decompose or be recycled, so versus
they're waterproof enough to last as long as they need to last for 3 or 6 months, but they are recyclable.
Okay, so anybody can answer this one, but as a consumer, I always look for the FSC logo on products. But Graham today, he did this excellent workshop which just made me think a little bit more about FSC products. And do you guys at Westonbirt, do you guys see the FSC logo as more of a commercialized marketing branding thing, or do you see actual action and evidence of action behind the FSC?
That's a great question. Do you want to pick that
so
up?
all of the timber we produce is FSC labelled, and it's also PEFC, which is like FSC. It stands for Programme for the Endorsement of Forest Certification Programmes. But they basically, both those labels mean the same thing. They mean that the woodlands where that timber came from have been independently audited and been certified against a standard which says that they're being managed sustainably. That can cover a very wide range of woodlands with different management objectives, but it just means that the international standard which FSC have set up has been translated into what this means in the UK, and we manage our woodlands so that we meet that. We're really quite proud that we do that, and we, in many respects, we go above 22 years ago or so, when the World Wildlife Fund and others were really promoting Forestry Stewardship Council and other certification schemes, but it was FSC particularly. They targeted the UK because the UK is the country in the world which has the second biggest imports of timber products. There's only Japan is bigger than the UK. So we're not really a country that produces much timber. You know, I might say we produce 1.3 million tons a year. It's nothing compared to the actual volume of wood-derived products which consumers suck into this country. So it has been really important in the UK's consumer goods market that labels like FSC and others, you know, unrelated to timber, things which give credibility to the environmental credentials of that product, are used and they're valued. How much consumers recognise them and use them, I'd throw that out to you guys, whether you actually go shopping in B&Q or somewhere else and you look for that label. Because if you do, I'm absolutely delighted, because that puts our product just a little bit closer to your hand.
I think I've always seen the FSC logo, but I've just never made the connection that in a way is a symbol of sustainability.
Yeah.
So it's nice to hear that, you know, we can back it up to say, you know, there is evidence to suggest that, you know, this is legit.
Yeah. And it has made a difference. You know, the last 20 years, forest certification has been pushed really hard around the world, especially by the likes of the World Wildlife Fund and many other environmental NGOs, and they've been very effective at raising the profile and making sure consumers think about that. So it's definitely worth it.
You can also compare that to other sort of slightly unrelated programs like the recycling program. Most people will recognise the logo now and they know what it means, and it's a good reminder. And I think the recycling program has, you know, made a massive change to how people think about throwing away items now. So I think they're very good reminders as well.
I just say, as a consumer, as a Forestry England person, it is just that awareness of FSC is brilliant and go for that, but then also anything, but is it FS? If there's an FSC that's being shipped from China and one that's being brought on a lorry from Kent, then it's you make that choice between which one you weigh up, and there's so like everything. There's so many things to think about. Yes,
it's not the only thing to think about. But you know, there are timber miles is a real thing, as Karen is saying. It's a bit like when I go and buy my apples in the supermarket. I'd always, by preference, buy apples from France than South Africa or New Zealand, because they've just been transported distance.
Like, something can be created, you know, to the utmost FSC policies, but what is that thing they've created, and was that created was it created and now it's accidentally causing more harm? So I'm thinking of like, we were thinking about tissue paper and toilet paper, and like, yes, it's, you know, economically it's amazing how it's, you know, been made with so much respect for trees and nature and wildlife. But after the consumers bought it, what then happens? What are then the effects? But yes, I don't need to
We're still having an impact, which is why the first thing in the waste hierarchy is reduce, isn't it? Just don't. If you can avoid using something in the first place, just don't.
Yeah. And I think it's also, you know, it's asking the question. So, you know, as a consumer, and I bought furniture recently, or tried to find furniture, it's really difficult. You know, if you ask people like John Lewis, or you go to any of the major places and ask for FSC furniture, it's quite hard to find. So, you know, it's asking them the question, because if people stop buying things, then people, you know, companies will shift to match their profits. So it's asking them, well, where has this come from? What is it made of? If it is FSC and it's some mango wood or something, and it's travelled a long way, it's being informed about and making the decision, or, you know, recycling and finding something from a second-hand shop and upcycling it. So, you know, we can all play a part in that, and just ask the question. That's the first point of call, really.
One final point on FSC labelling. So environmental labels of all sorts are the most counterfeited things in the world at the moment. There is a huge trade in counterfeit goods which claim environmental credentials. So I don't know does that bag have an FSC logo on it or not? I don't know. But if you see the FSC logo, the sure way to know that it's likely to be genuine is that at the bottom of it, it'll have some unique numbers, because every product that goes through a supply chain that's got FSC on it has to be individually licensed. So if you see FSC on anything that doesn't have those unique numbers down the bottom, it's a fake. Oh, go away, dog.
It's still like me today, huh? I was going to say something on that one.
We need fencing just to keep dogs away.
That's what I was going to say about FSC then.
And I can chip in on that. One thing I noticed doing that workshop is the pack of toilet paper that we had the FSC logo, no certificate number, nothing else,
Really?
just the symbol and FSC.
That was Mandrak's toilet roll,
Mandrak's
wasn't it?
Kimberley Clark,
Interesting,
yeah.
so look that up.
Well, they are breaching the agreement to use that label and report them.
I was going to say, if you have got 5 spare minutes, but it ends up being a lot longer, it's really fascinating to type those codes into the FSC website, and you can track where things have come from. It's like, oh, I have a new toilet roll from over there. When I was in my toilet roll research stuff, one of the things about toilet rolls and tissue is because it's such short fibres, it can't be recycled. I think I'm right, Sophie. So what they're doing is they're using recycled paper. So it's a paper that can no longer really be used for much else, gets used for toilet rolls, etc., for sanitary use, because that will then be thrown away. So it can't be recycled because it's been used for personal sanitary as well.
And there has been a huge increase in the use of trees for toilet paper because of customer preferences for thicker velvet type toilet papers. That's had a very big impact, hasn't it? I think I understand on tree use for toilet paper.
Cool. Right. One more question. Has COVID affected the trees in any way?
It's made them more popular. No, it's been tremendous actually. The way, well, people have been forced to not be able to do the things that they used to do, and that has generally made people a lot more aware of the green space around them and appreciated it more. It's pushed our visitor numbers up, even though we've had periods when we were closed, I think about 30%. We're estimating something like 290 million visits a year, spread over 26 million people who are regularly visiting, which is a pretty incredible figure, really. And yeah, it just goes to show you the power of green space and the very positive benefits you can get from it.
The woods and forests round near me, they've been hugely popular over sort of the lockdown period, and the use of sort of like mountain biking has gone up hugely, and people just walking in the woods for recreation because they can't go and haven't been able to do the normal things they would do. So it's been really good for people appreciating the woods. But I do notice when I walk out now that I see face masks sort of scattered around the woods. So I guess that's kind of one consequence of using products, isn't it? That you do see those kind of scattered around, littering now more than you would do. So it's you always have like peaks of positive change, and then associated with that there'll always be little bits of negative change that you have to just kind of adapt to your behaviour and make sure you can kind of cut the negative bits out.
Yes, and some of our more popular sites have probably been too busy in places. You know, not off-site parking can be a problem to people who live in the local community. but a lot of people have used the phrase nature's health service, which is a good phrase for green space and woodlands.
Do you have any more questions from the audience?
I've got your uniforms.
Yes, very topical at the moment.
Are they made overseas?
Gosh, almost certainly they are made overseas. Who knows most
Can I
about?
just say I didn't hear the question?
Are uniforms made overseas?
Ah.
It's interesting you asked that question because this is a relatively new uniform. When was it introduced? About 12 months ago.
Yeah.
And we're just going through a process of recycling the old uniform, and it's probably the issue on our corporate intranet, which is like how we communicate each other, has provoked most debate from staff in, literally in this last week. Well, Karen, I think you posted the first question, didn't you? I forget what your question was. You were just saying some of the new uniform wasn't warm enough, weren't you? I think?
Yeah, so we have different bits of uniform. Some of the old uniform has been taken out of use. That is stuff that is really warm for snowy, wet, cold days, and then there seems to be a whole deluge of people.
But to return to the question, yes, I think it is mostly.
I don't think it does say actually. But
I do know the procurement process went through a lot of environmental questions in there, but the reality is that it's very, very, very difficult to buy any clothing which the materials made in the UK, the bits are stitched together, the corporate logos are applied. Very difficult to get that done all in the UK. So it is purchased with the best environmental credentials we could manage, but they're far from perfect.
yes, and the other big debate about items of clothing is, these are primarily this is totally polyester. This is mostly polyester. Is that polyester better or worse than cotton, for example? But actually, cotton is arguably not that, although it's a natural product.
It's a very big water footprint.
It has a massive footprint in terms of water use, as you probably know. So, and one of the benefits actually of the polyester clothing, one of the perhaps disappointing things about us changing is that we've got lots of old uniform. The polyester is really hard wearing and lasts a lot longer than cotton items, so you've got to think about the whole life cycle when you're making choices about clothing, and that was one of the decision things that was looked at in the choice of what we moved to was life cycle and cotton versus polyester in terms of that life cycle.
So is that balance also about washing as well, in terms of obviously cotton and microplastics from those, using guppy bags to catch any microplastics to stop them going down your washing machine pipes, and just looking after our clothes and wearing them as much as we can, so not changing when, just sewing them, fixing them before giving them back.
And on top of that, there's also a whole thing. I always get them mixed up between wool and cotton, but I think it's cotton in the hills kills. So if you're wearing cotton clothing and you get really wet, it takes so long to dry out. Yeah. And whereas kind of synthetic stuff, it dries out quite quickly, which is fine if you're not out for long. But if you're out for several hours, then you will get really, really chilled and really cold, and that's when you can start moving into hypothermia.
I did. Sorry, diversionary story. I did go to, in the days before you could go anywhere, before COVID, I went to a forestry conference in Austria, and we visited a factory there where they were using beech trees and spruce trees to turn into polymers, which were then turned into thread and into clothes. And a byproduct of that process was actually the sweetener that's put in sugar-free chewing gum, so xylitol. So trees are not just sawn up for wood like this, but they can also be turned into chemical feedstock as well.
Also, on the topic of uniforms, could you wear fabric that's microdegradable?
I'm not sure I know what microdegradable is.
Well, just degradable. when you go out of it?
Oh, do you mean so once it's end of life, it will
Yeah.
rot down?
Yeah.
I don't know is the answer to that.
I guess cotton technically
Yeah.
would fit that
this
bill, I guess.
cotton decomposes eventually. Takes about 2 months, I think,
Yeah.
was our test earlier. So it doesn't take very long at all. Obviously, things like wood. So
Yes.
we all wore woolly
Yeah.
jumpers, which possibly was an option, but. Something perhaps we could all do in our home lives rather than as mass uniform. It's probably a bit harder to achieve, but I think our old uniform is going to be recycled. Not quite sure what that entail,
one of our colleagues corrected that phrase. It's being because it's being turned into a biofuel. It's what was the phrase? Energy recovery. It's going through an energy recovery process. It's not technically recycling.
It's amazing. I think it just highlights how there's always two different sides, and it is such a big complex environment and climate and all of it. And recycling is such a big complex conundrum. Really, there's always an argument on either side. Do we have any more questions from the audience?
So, in Europe, is there lots of forest fires going on? So, is there a chance they're going to come in the UK and there's going to be a forest fire in the UK? And then, if so, what can we do to prevent that from happening?
Good question.
Good question.
So, at the moment,
I didn't
so at
hear.
the moment in Europe, there's quite a few forest fires going on. Is there any chance that forest fires will start happening in the UK? And if so, what can we do to prevent them happening?
I'm on a team. It's what's it called? Incident management team, and one of our projects is to deal with forest fires as and when they happen. So we take people from all across the Forestry Commission, and we do sort of scenario days, where we all get together in an office, and then we get given like a task that says, oh, you've just had a forest fire in this area. How do you plan that out, and how do you sort of respond to that? So everyone in the team is given a role, and we're sort of given instructions on how to respond, and then we kind of run this scenario, and then we sort of see what works and what doesn't, and then we make changes and say, okay, we need to do this in future if it does happen. So we do have preparations in place for forest fires. We did have some 1 or 2 years ago, I think, that weren't massively serious, but we have had them already. It's just a case of sort of securing the sites, putting the fires out, and then really trying to recover what you can from that site, which usually means replanting species. But if they become sort of more common, perhaps due to climatic conditions changing, then it might mean that we have to kind of think about what trees we plant. You might want to plant some trees that are more sort of able to cope in a fire. You can get some trees that store a lot of water in them and they don't catch light so easily. So you can build barriers of these trees, sort of separating more susceptible species. So that could be something that you might have to think about in the future if they do happen more often.
In terms of the public, the single biggest thing you can do is, by all means, go out and enjoy the forest and the countryside, but don't take disposable barbecues with you. Because one of the incidents Rob referred to that happened 2 years ago in Dorset, the fire brigade, I think, found something like 18 disposable barbecues. So I mean, Graham's done the right thing there by having a proper fire pit on soil. But the problem with a disposable barbecue is, it gets so hot that if you just put it down on dryish grass during a drought, the grass will catch fire, or the pine needles that it's sitting on. I remember once I was out with some friends, and one had a Land Rover, and he put the back of the Land Rover down and had a huge block of wood and put the disposable barbecue on that. And after half an hour, this solid block of wood just caught fire. So disposable barbecues are almost certainly, I would say, the
Bad
single,
news, yeah.
the single
yeah.
biggest
Please
threat.
don't take them to our forests or anyone else's forests for that moment.
Unfortunately, we've not had any on the scale of Europe or United States,
Yeah.
but the one in Dorset was, 100 hectares, so it was big, probably.
Yeah.
And another one in Berkshire,
Yeah.
probably 10 years earlier, which again was big, but it is, as Rob's saying, when we plant new forests or replant them, we do now think about proximity of trees to buildings and so on, because there are various design principles you can employ to reduce that risk.
And with the projections for climate change in the UK, one of the things which has been modelled is the number of what they call heat waves. So they define a heat wave as 4 or more consecutive days of very high temperatures, and those are the sorts of spells of weather which are really dangerous for forest and heathland fires. So we will get more of those in the future, and in the south and centre of England in particular, the hazard from wildfire will definitely get greater. So our greatest protection against that, as Andrew says, is basically public awareness, making sure that everyone understands that a day out in the countryside with, for instance, your disposable barbecue could actually result in hundreds and hundreds of hectares of trees and wildlife being lost.
We don't have a big problem in the Arboretum yet, but I think the biggest fire risk we have is the Downs area where there's grass, where you came in between there and the restaurant. We have the hay cut on that once a year in July or August, and the few days that hay is drying, when that hay gets dry, that is quite a big fire risk, and it only potentially needs one of our visitors to throw fortunately not many of our visitors smoke, but it only needs a cigarette butt to go in that drying hay, and that would quite rapidly spread across the Downs there potentially.
Okay, time for one more question.
Keen one here, if no one else has got one.
With stuff like animals, when you bring in animals from different countries in here, sometimes they can be harmful. So when picking trees from different countries, how do you decide whether or not they'll be fine over here?
Yeah, it's a great question, because some of the... Sorry, yes, who didn't hear the question. So, a lot of you are probably aware that if animals are imported, they can bring disease in, or other problems. What do we do to avoid that problem occurring with trees? There are multiple problems with importing trees, and it's true that actually in the last century we've planted some species of tree that, if they're planted in the wrong location, can become invasive because they just spread and multiply. One tree species, Western hemlock, can be a bit like that. And I guess another plant, it's not a tree, which has had a devastating impact on some of our ancient woodlands, is rhododendron, because it just seeds so prolifically. It looks lovely in May when it's in purple flower, but it creates such a dense shade, it shades out all the other native flora and fauna. The other danger of bringing in new tree species is they could be harbouring some pest or disease that we don't appreciate or haven't had in this country before, which maybe not only affects that tree species but might affect tree species that are already present in the country. So, in introducing tree species, we do have to have regard to the biosecurity considerations, and even actually bringing in seed. There are pests and diseases that we know can be transported just by the seed. So bringing the seed in and growing that isn't always an adequate solution either. But the great thing is we're far more aware of all of those risks now than we were even 30 years ago when James and I started in forestry. Yeah.
It's probably the same. So the trees that we bring here. So when we go to places like Italy, or we might go to Chile, or we might go to California, and we pick seeds. We obviously they're planned trips with those countries, and we have licenses in place. We go out and collect those, gather evidence about how those trees and those plants are growing and what's around them, what the conditions are. They're then cleaned and then brought back to this country under very special, strict conditions. They then often go to Alice Holt, which is our research centre in Surrey, and they're often screened to look for any issues within the seed before they're then moved on for us to then germinate in our propagation unit, and
so
hopefully
we
in the
can
next
X-ray seeds to see whether they've got little weevils in them.
Yeah, or any other bugs. So they're screened at that point, and then they're brought to places like Westonbirt, to our propagation unit, and later this autumn we're hoping to build a quarantine facility, so when we have seeds in, or when we're offered plants that are potentially very rare across the rest of the country, around the world, that have a holding bay so that we can keep them contained and monitor them for any pests and disease that might come out of that plant, to make sure that then that doesn't then transfer across to the rest of the plants in the propagation unit or out in the wider arboretum. So there's extra steps that we'll take, and obviously through our normal biosecurity measures to keep an eye on them, but that's what we do to make sure we don't import anything nasty, but keeping an eye out on things. And a lot of these things come from packaging and pallets and things like that are brought in through shipping, really.
When they built the Olympic Village in London, they wanted to sort of put the development up very quickly, so they imported trees that were fully grown from abroad, oak trees, and they put them up around the Olympic Village, but they had oak processionary moth caterpillars on them that they were imported in with, and that meant that we had an introduction of this invasive moth into the country, and it damages oak trees and eats them and eats the leaves, and then the fibres on the caterpillars can give you a skin irritation and breathing problems if you inhale them. So we have a huge programme in the southeast and London to try and eradicate the OPM moths that have arrived now, and it means that when you buy oak trees now, you can only buy them from OPM-free areas, and you can't move trees from area to area unless they have certificates and tree passports. So each time there's a new pest and disease introduced, it means you have to bring in more laws and legislation to kind of combat that.
So can I ask a question following that then? It's kind of like a consumer question. As a consumer, how do we know if you go to the garden centre or the local supermarket or wherever to buy, and there's plants there, how do we know they are pest or disease free?
We don't at the moment, but we are, along with a lot of other people, especially the Royal Horticultural Society, working on a plant health assurance standard, which will have a label and a logo called Plant Healthy. So, as well as looking out for your FSC, when you're buying plants in future, go to the garden centre and look for Plant Healthy on the label, and that means that those plants will have come from a nursery, a plant nursery, tree nursery, where there's a very strict standard around pests and diseases, and every year someone's going to come in who's independent from that business and check that the right things are being done and that they can't find any pests and diseases. And it probably is the single most important thing we can do in the future around plant health in this country, is to have a really secure biosecurity label and assurance which spans all the way across forestry, through horticulture and into gardens as well, when probably gardening is the biggest risk of importing pests and diseases in this country.
When you start going abroad again for your holidays, just don't bring plant material back in your suitcase.
Ever, no matter how lovely it looks,
Even if you
leave
see
those
a
seeds
nice pine
behind.
cone, just leave it where it was and take a photograph of it.
Thank you, everyone. I think we have unfortunately run out of time. So thank you all for your questions. If you have any future questions, you can talk to your teachers, pass them on and maybe forward them to us. and I'll forward them onto our panel and the other members. Thank you all for your time. Just to quickly check it.
Can I just say one
Yes,
final
you
thing? If there's anyone in the audience who is thinking about a career or an education in environmental sciences, in forestry, or anything related, and you have any questions about it, send them back to us and we'll try and answer them. Because we need people like you to come to be teachers, horticulturalists, managers of the countryside, and any one of you can do it. No reason why you can't. So please keep that in mind as a career.